Good afternoon, everyone. It's time for Mrs. Ballou Reads, and we're continuing to read Tum and Nutmeg, Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall by Emily Byrne and pictures by Nick Price, and published by, let's see if you remember, Little Brown and Company. And if you remember, last week we left General Marchmouse. He was in the school with all the gerbils, and they were planning an escape, and Nutmeg and Tumtum had taken off to get help, and they were going to get ballerinas to help, and they needed the pogo sticks, and we're going to find out if this mission is going to work this afternoon, so we'll find out. But before we get into that, I want to remind everybody that the library is now open for curbside delivery. You can't come into the building, but you can make reserves, and we'll check them out to you and put them on a cart for you to pick up. The library is open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday 10 to 2 for curbside delivery, and on Thursdays 2:30 to 6:30 for curbside delivery. You can also return your books at the same time. They go in a bin down by the community room door. We don't want them in the drop box, please. And also, we're going to be starting registration for summer reading on Monday. If you have any questions about that, it's a program called Read Squared, and there's information on our website. You can also email me if you have questions. I visited with the school kids yesterday, and hopefully they are all excited and ready to register next week. I've just booked an animal program. I'm very excited. We're going to have a great program. Even if we can't be together physically, we'll have a great program with lots of fun. Okay, time to read. Chapter 10. The general would have been tickled to know that Arthur and Lucy had spent the whole of break time thinking about him. As soon as the bell rang, Arthur had rushed into the playground to find his sister and tell her all about Miss Short's plans. As he had expected, Lucy thought it was all just as unfair as he did. "It's bad enough for selling the gerbils, but she's got no right to sell our mouse," she said crossly. "We brought him here thinking he would have a happy home, but if he goes to the pet shop, he might end up with someone horrible, someone who forgets to feed him." When they had found the mouse in the dollhouse, they had not felt nearly as protective of him as they did now. They had just been annoyed that he had made so much mess and that he had eaten Nutmeg's biscuits. But when they had seen him looking so unhappy in the gerbil's cage, they had felt a pang of remorse, thinking it might have been kinder to have kept him at Rose Cottage, and now that he was to be sent away forever, they felt even worse. "What will happen if he goes to the pet shop and no one buys him?" Arthur asked. "I suppose he might be put down," Lucy said glumly. "Put down?" Arthur whispered, not liking the sound of this. "What do you mean, put down?" "Oh, I don't know," Lucy replied, not wanting to upset him further. "I just mean we might rescue him before something awful happens." "How can we rescue him if we can't open the cage?" Arthur asked. "The janitor's got the keys." "Well, we can just ask him to open it then," Lucy said, not knowing what else to suggest. "He opened it when we wanted to put the mouse in the cage, after all." "I know, but he's not going to let us take him out again without Miss Short's permission," Arthur said defeatedly. And Lucy knew he was right. "Well, we should tell Nutmeg then," Lucy said, "and ask her to come to school and rescue him for us." "Do you think she'd come all this way?" Arthur asked doubtfully. Somehow he didn't like the idea of Nutmeg coming to his school. She was their secret, and he felt they should keep her to themselves. "Of course she would," Lucy said confidently. "The school's not far from Rose Cottage after all, and she can come at night when there's no one here." "I suppose so," Arthur said, but he still felt uneasy. Later that day, before going to bed, he and Lucy sat down and wrote a long letter to Nutmeg, telling her all about Miss Short's plan to sell their mouse and asking her to return him to Rose Cottage. "If you bring him home again, we'll find him a nice big bucket to live in, and we'll let him out for runs in the bath. We'll look after him very well," they concluded. Meanwhile, Nutmeg's day had been most eventful. After leaving the school, she and Tumtum had made straight for the Royal Mouse Army's barracks to see if they could borrow some pogo sticks. They needed 13, for Miss Tiptoe always had 13 ballerinas in her school. It was something she was very particular about. The barracks were on the other side of the village park, in a dugout underneath the war memorial. It had formerly been a fox's lair, but the Royal Mouse Army had taken it over some years ago, and now it was a warren of underground dormitories and ammunition stores. Tumtum and Nutmeg arrived at the main entrance to find two sentries playing poker. When Tumtum showed them General Marchmouse's letter, requesting that the pogo sticks be released immediately, they were not at all helpful. There he is, showing the letter. One said that all the pogo sticks were locked in a storeroom and that he didn't know where to find the key. The other said that he thought he might know where the key was, but that he couldn't go and look for it because he had a sprained ankle. And then the other one said he had a sprained ankle too, at which both sentries started cackling. Tumtum became exasperated. "Now look here," he said crossly. "I happen to be on lunching terms with your commanding officer, Brigadier Flashmouse, and..." Suddenly, both the sentries became more cooperative. One offered Tumtum a slug of whiskey from his hip flask, while the other went inside and returned with 13 pogo sticks, each with the Royal Mouse Army's initials, RMA, engraved near the tip. Tumtum signed for them, then the Nutmouses hurried on their way. They made straight for the ballet school, crossing the lane at the top of the green, then climbing up the steep verge that led into the churchyard. "Hang on," Tumtum said, suddenly noticing 3 women coming up the church path with bundles of flowers. He and Nutmeg waited until they had gone into the porch, then followed behind. There were more women inside the church arranging big bouquets of lilies, but they were concentrating much too hard on their work to notice 2 mice scuttling down the aisle toward the vestry. The entrance to Miss Tiptoe's school was through a little mouse hole, hidden behind an old oak chest. There was no door, just a frayed velvet curtain to keep out the draft. The Nutmouses dumped the pogo sticks on the floor and went inside. The school was in a big, chilly cupboard with dark red walls and a flagstone floor. Long ago, it was where all the church silver had been kept. But then the silver had been sold, and the cupboard wasn't needed anymore, so Miss Tiptoe had taken it over. The school was lit by candles borrowed from the church, which only gave a dim light, and it took a moment or two for Tumtum's and Nutmeg's eyes to become accustomed to the gloom. They could just make out the ballerinas in the far corner, practicing at the bar. All 13 of them were present, dressed in white tutus with gold braids in their hair. Miss Tiptoe was sitting next to them at the piano, playing soft, tinkling tunes. Tumtum knew the piano well. It had once lived in the drawing room of Nutmouse Hall, but he had given it to Miss Tiptoe when her last piano had got dry rot. Miss Tiptoe's pianos often got dry rot, for the cupboard was rather damp. The Nutmouses waited until Miss Tiptoe had finished playing before approaching her. She was surprised to see them, for mice seldom visited her school unannounced, but their expressions clearly told her that something was wrong. "Take a rest, girls," she instructed her class. Then she got up and led the Nutmouses to her desk, which stood in a corner of the cupboard, raised on a red hymn book. She walked with a stick, but her back was as straight as a ruler. She sat in a big throne-like chair, while the Nutmouses faced her perched on tiny embroidered footstools. Miss Tiptoe was very beautiful and composed, and everyone found her a little intimidating. She was tall and thin and gray, astonishingly old. No one knew how old, but one of Nutmeg's sisters had been taught by her when she was a young girl, and she had seemed very old then. And now, of course, she was even older. And there's the ballerinas practicing at the bar, and there they are starting to talk. She listened silently while Tumtum told her all about the general's capture and explained the amazing role they hoped her ballerinas might play in his and the gerbil's release. The Nutmouses had expected that she might be shocked at their request, but she had a calm, wise expression on her face. Miss Tiptoe had seen many odd things in her life, and she knew the strange and wonderful plots of all the classical ballets, so it took a lot to surprise her. I'm sure your ballerinas will look most elegant on pogo sticks, Miss Tiptoe," Tumtum concluded, feeling rather awkward. Miss Tiptoe looked at him piercingly. "Imagine that you were in my position, Mr. Nutmouse," she said, speaking in a very clear voice. "Would you risk your pupils' lives for the sake of the general?" Tumtum said nothing, but his silence was as good as an answer as any. For of course he knew that if he had a daughter, he wouldn't want her risking her life on account of anyone. Miss Tiptoe's expression softened. "Is the general a close friend of yours, Mr. Nutmouse?" she asked kindly. "I suppose he is," Tumtum replied. "I know he can be exasperating and a bit above himself, But there is a side to him which is good and loyal too, and he's a great hero, of course. Miss Tiptoe nodded. She did not know the general well, but like all the mice in the village, she felt a certain loyalty to him. For whenever there had been trouble, such as when rats had invaded the village grain store, he and troops had always risen to save the day. So now that it was his hour of need, was it fair to desert him? She looked pensive a moment, for she was still wavering, but her conscience told her what to do. "Bring your pogo sticks inside, Mr. Nutmouse," she said calmly. "My ballerinas will do what is required of them." Tumtum and Nutmeg both let out a cry of relief. "Oh, thank you, Miss Tiptoe, thank you," Nutmeg gulped, leaping up to embrace her. But by the time Nutmeg had found her feet, Miss Tiptoe had already glided back to her pupils. "Come along now, girls," she cried, rapping her stick on the floor. "We have a new routine to rehearse." Chapter 11. None of the ballerinas had ever used a pogo stick before, but they took to them at once, leaping into the air as gracefully as gazelles, with Miss Tiptoe accompanying them on the piano. Before long, they were bouncing so high they could touch the cupboard ceiling. When she felt they could bounce no better, Miss Tiptoe sent the girls off to have tea, which was served next door in a flour bin in the vicarage kitchen. "Oh, Miss Tiptoe, they were splendid!" cried Nutmeg, who had been watching spellbound. Miss Tiptoe smiled graciously. Then she listened as Tumtum spelled out the plan of attack. "We'll come back early in the morning and escort you and your girls to room 2B before the school opens," he began. "That way you can familiarize yourselves with the classroom and take instructions from the general before any of the children turn up. Then you can find somewhere to hide away until the janitor comes on his lunchtime rounds. It will be a long wait, but it's important that all the dancers are out of sight before school begins." Miss Tiptoe raised her eyes when Tumtum mentioned taking instructions from the general, but she made no comment. "I will entrust you with the refreshments, Mrs. Nutmouse," was all she said. "If my girls are to spend all morning cooped up underneath the filing cabinet, they will need something to nibble." "Of course," Nutmeg replied eagerly, and she at once began planning a sumptuous picnic. By the time the Nutmouses left the vestry, the flower arrangers had gone. The lights had been turned off, and the church was almost dark. As they walked back down the aisle, hand in hand, they heard the clock strike 5. And there they are, walking down the aisle. 5 o'clock, Tumtum, Nutmeg sighed. "And we've so much to do. I have to prepare the picnic, and then we'll have to go back to the school and tell the general what's happening, and—" "There is no need to go back to the school tonight," Tumtum said firmly. "We've a busy day tomorrow, and we must go home and rest. We'll see the general first thing in the morning." The thought of rest was very tempting to Nutmeg, for all the excitement was beginning to take its toll on her. Her eyes felt heavy, and her ankles were starting to ache. As they walked home to Nutmouse Hall, she leaned wearily on Tumtum's shoulder. They'd only been away for a day, and yet the house had a deserted feel to it. The big room seemed empty and echoey now that the general had gone. Nutmeg felt quite forlorn as she set about in the kitchen making a meatloaf and a mushroom quiche and a salmon mousse and a lemon cheesecake and 24 jam tarts for the ballerinas. While she worked, Tumtum put his feet up in the library. He felt forlorn too. "What if our plan doesn't work?" Nutmeg said anxiously as they finally sat down together and to supper in the kitchen. "It will work, dear," Tumtum replied reassuringly. "You saw how high those ballerinas could hop on their pogo sticks. They'll have no difficulty bouncing up and snatching the janitor's keys." "But what if he catches them?" Nutmeg fretted. "Oh, those poor young girls. If he were to hurt them, I'd never forgive myself." "Now, don't fuss, dear," Tumtum said. "They'll be bouncing so fast the janitor won't even see them coming." "I do hope you're right," Nutmeg said, but she could feel a dread rising in her stomach. It had been her idea to enlist the help of the ballet school, and it had seemed such a splendid idea at first. And yet, as the time of the rescue operation drew nearer, she had a horrible feeling that something was to go horribly wrong. Perhaps the general was right, she thought. Perhaps the ballerinas simply aren't up to it. Nutmeg worried all through supper, and then she worried while she washed up, and she was still worrying when she and Tumtum sat down in the library to drink their cocoa. She knew she would never get to sleep, so she decided to go and tidy Arthur and Lucy's bedroom. "I don't want them thinking I'm neglecting them, and this morning I noticed that Lucy's sweater needs darning. she said when Tumtum protested. "And I still haven't cleaned up all the mess the general made in the dollhouse." "Very well, dear, but don't be long," Tumtum said, stifling a yawn. "We both need an early night, and you've already done quite enough bustling for one day." But when Nutmeg reached the attic, she found the children's letter, and that made her even more anxious. For even if she managed to get the general back from the school, she knew she couldn't possibly let Arthur and Lucy keep him in a bucket. He wouldn't like that at all. She sat a long while at her desk in the dollhouse, nibbling the end of her fountain pen and wondering how best to reply. The letter she finally wrote went as follows. "Dear Arthur and Lucy, I intend to rescue your mouse tomorrow. This will be a very difficult mission, and I cannot guarantee that I will succeed. But if I do, perhaps it would be best if we were to set him free again, for I happen to know the mouse in question, and I doubt he would much enjoy living in a bucket. Love, Nutmeg." Then while the children slept, she darned the elbow of Lucy's sweater and the toe of one of Arthur's socks, and she scrubbed the dollhouse kitchen and put all the furniture back to rights in the living room. And finally feeling more tired than she could ever remember, she limped back to Nutmouse Hall and collapsed beside Tumtum in their four-poster bed. Everyone in Rose Cottage slept soundly that night, but there was no such peace for the general. After the Nutmouses had left him, his day had gone from bad to worse. After break, there had been a nature lesson conducted by a gangly teacher called Mr. Greaves, who had asked the class questions such as what field mice do in winter and where squirrels sleep at night. The general had shouted all the answers loud and clear from his cage, but the teacher had ignored him. Then there had been a math lesson, during which the children had recited their times tables. The gerbils turned out to know them all perfectly, but when the general tried to join in, he got in the most dreadful muddle and said that 3 times 3 was 33 and that 6 times 6 was 66, and then his cellmates had mocked him all the more. By the time the children filed off for lunch, the general was feeling more homesick than he'd ever felt before. Even when he had been away at war for whole days at end, he had never felt as homesick as this. Then the janitor had turned up to give the prisoners more revolting seeds to eat, and the general felt sicker than ever. There was something off-putting about the janitor. He was so tall, he had to stoop almost double to open the door of the cage, and his fist was so wide when he reached inside to dump the food in the feeding trough, the animals had to press themselves back against the bars so as not to be crushed. He was a curiously-looking man, too, with thick tufts of black hair coming from his nostrils and red veins in his cheeks. The general made clear his displeasure at the luncheon being served. "Take away this filthy bird-seed. Bring me some decent roast beef," he shouted. But the janitor just slammed the cage door shut on him. "How can you digest that munk?" the general asked sullenly, watching the gerbils crowd around the trough. But it had been a whole day since they had last eaten, and the gerbils were too busy eating to reply. As the afternoon went on, with a history lesson followed by a spelling test, to which the gerbils recited all the correct answers, and he all the wrong ones, the general began to feel more and more wretched. And then a new crisis arose. Shortly after the children had gone home, the janitor appeared at the door of room 2B. He found Miss Short in the room tidying her desk. "Can I lock up in here now?" he asked her. "Yes, I'm just going. I'll be taking these beastly things with me," she said, nodding toward the cage. "I was going to get rid of them on Saturday, but I'm seeing my sister in town tonight, so I might as well take them now." "What do you do with them?" the janitor asked casually. "I'll take them to the pet shop," she replied. "I wouldn't do that," he said. "I know old Mr. Dye who runs it, and he won't be wanting a cage full of flea-bitten old rodents like this. He sells fancy things, carp and budgies and the like." Miss Short sucked in her breath. "Well, if the pet shop can't take them, I'll have to think again," she said crisply. "I'm sure the vet could dispose of them for me." At this, the gerbils let out a collective cry of horror and started scrambling frantically, desperate to get out, while the general clutched the bars, swearing furiously at his captors. Then the floor lurched beneath their feet as the cage was hoisted into the air. Tumtum and Nutmeg set out early next morning to collect the ballerinas. The milkman had not yet stirred, and the church spire was still shrouded in mist. When they arrived in the vestry, they found Miss Tiptoe and her class waiting for them outside the cupboard. Sorry, this is chapter 12. The girls were dressed in beige tutus, which had their names embroidered on them in silver thread. The Nutmouses studied them a moment so that they might remember who was who. There was Trixie Belle, who had the long, beautiful ears. There was Millie Bobbit, who was the shortest. There was Lily Loop, who was the tallest. There was Horseradish with the pink braids in her tail, and Tartar with the sharp silver toenails. But it was no good. They could never remember so many names. Just trying made their head spins. And they were such odd names, too. In their day, mice had been given simple names like Nutmeg. And there's some of those ballerinas. You told me that the school had wooden floors, so I decided beige would be our best disguise, Miss Tiptoe said. She'd been up all night sewing. How clever of you, Nutmeg replied. She suddenly felt embarrassed by the bright green cape she was wearing and wished she had dressed more discreetly. Presently the party set forth. They were a curious convoy, with the girls bouncing along like crickets on their pogo sticks, and Miss Tiptoe gliding elegantly beside them, while Tumtum and Nutmeg strangled in the rear with the picnic baskets. The girls were in high spirits, and Horseradish shrieked when Tartar tried to bounce away with her earmuffs. "Young ladies, please recall that you are representing my ballet school," Miss Tiptoe said sharply. And then they all looked a little bit chastened. Before long, they reached the school gates and saw the playground stretching before them. The girls all craned their necks as they looked up at the vast steel climbing frame. To them it seemed as tall as a skyscraper. "This way," said Tumtum, leading the party toward the air vent. He pushed the pogo sticks through the grill first, then the mice climbed inside. The ballerinas had never been in a school for human children, and the building felt cold and unfamiliar. They found something ominous about the huge shoes in the lockers and the enormous overalls hanging from the pegs on the wall. It was all so different from their own little school in the vestry. They kept close together as they followed Tumtum under the door of room 2B. It was dark, for the blinds were shut, and they couldn't see as far as the cage. Everything was deathly quiet. "The prisoners must still be asleep," Tumtum said, leading his party across the room. "General, Gerbils, we're back," he called up from beneath the table. "Throw down the ladder." But there wasn't a sound. He called again, wondering why they didn't reply. Then, blinking, Nutmeg let out a cry. "The cage! It's gone!" The nutmouses stood motionless, stunned by this discovery. They couldn't understand it. Miss Short had said that she was taking the gerbils to the pet shop on Saturday, but Saturday wasn't until tomorrow. "The cage must have been moved to another part of the school," Tumtum said urgently. "We'll search all the classrooms. Miss Tiptoe, you and your girls head down the corridor to your left and look under every door. We'll try the rooms to the right." The mice hurtled back out of room 2B and dispersed down the corridor, shouting the general's name. Miss Tiptoe's ballerinas bounced high and low around the gymnasium, the art room, and the kitchen. And the nutmouses scuttled around room 3A and room 1C and all around the staff room and the music room. But the cage was nowhere to be seen. "He must have gone to the pet shop," Nutmeg wailed. She had a sudden vision of Mrs. Marchmouse living the rest of her life alone in the big rackety gun cupboard with no one to keep her company, and she started to weep. "I will take my girls back to the vestry, since it seems there is no use for us here," Miss Tiptoe said tactfully. So the subdued rescue party made its way back down the corridor toward the air vent. The girls walked quietly, pulling their pogo sticks behind them. None of them had met the general before, but the thought of any mouse being taken to a pet shop was enough to take all the bounce out of them. But just as they were about to climb back outside, Tumtum suddenly stopped in his tracks. "What's that?" he said, motioning the party to be still. They all stood quivering, their ears pricked. They could hear faint squeals. "Over there! There and there!" Tumtum cried, pointing to the cupboard door across the corridor. Miss Tiptoe's dancers had passed by it. They'd looked in all the classrooms, but they hadn't thought of exploring the cupboards, too. As Tumtum's wriggled under the door, he could hear the gerbils howling, and rising above them was the voice of a most indignant General Marchmouse. "We're here, you fools! Let us out! Let us out!" "Where?" Tumtum shouted, fumbling for his flashlight. "It's pitch black. I can't see a thing." "Here!" squeaked a dozen voices. "Here!" "Where?" Tumtum called again. "Up here!" they chorused impatiently. Tumtum craned his neck and shone his flashlight back and forth along the shelves. At first all he could see were cardboard boxes. But then, on the lowest shelf off the ground, he noticed a big lump covered with a filthy gray blanket. He shone his flashlight over it, trying to make out what it was. All of a sudden, the corner of the blanket tweaked, and the straw ladder came tumbling to the floor. Quick, I've found them, Tumtum shouted under the door. The rest of the mice raced after him, and they all clambered up to the prisoners. Uncover us, the general shouted furiously, and with the nut mouses and Miss Tiptoe and the 13 ballerinas pulling and tugging as one, they eventually managed to drag the blanket from the cage. When Tumtum shone his light on the prisoners, it was clear that there had been quite a commotion. The exercise wheel had been snapped in two, and everyone was badly bruised. The general had a black eye and was in especially ill humor. There it is. Each prisoner, why the devil didn't you come back last night? He asked furiously. We'd been sentenced to death, every last one of us. Each prisoner had a different version of what had happened, and everyone talked at once, so the story was rather hard to follow. But it seemed that after Miss Short's threat to transport them all to the vet, the general had become quite wild with anger, and when she picked up the cage, he'd sunk his teeth deep into her finger, drawing blood, or biting it right off, depending on whose account you believed. Miss Short had then dropped the cage on the floor, and it had landed with a great crash, which is what had caused all the cuts and bruises and black eyes. She had shrieked a good deal, using words that had made the lady gerbils cover their ears, but the upshot was that she was too frightened to go near the cage again, and she had told the janitor that she would not take it in her car, nor did she want it to remain in room TV. So the janitor had offered to get rid of it, saying that he would dispose of the gerbils over the weekend. Miss Short had not inquired how he intended to do this, but he had muttered something about having a friend who kept owls, and that had made all the prisoners quake, for they knew that owls liked nothing more than a succulent little mouse or gerbil to nibble. And then the janitor had dumped them in the dark cupboard out of Miss Short's sight. He had thrown the blanket over them in order to muffle their protests and left them to await their terrifying fate. The worst of it was thinking you'd never find us, Mrs. Nutmouse, one of the gerbils said pitifully. Nutmeg said nothing, for she was terrified that her plan might no longer work. Wouldn't be nearly so easy now that the cage was in a cupboard instead of in the classroom, and besides, the janitor's routine might have changed. There was no knowing what time he'd come and feed the gerbils now, or if he would come at all. Our plan will still succeed, so long as everyone follows my commands to the letter, the general said bossily, reading her thoughts. Then he looked at Tumtum and started giving orders. You and all the dancers must hide on the other side of the corridor, under the shoe lockers, until the janitor comes to feed us, he said. When he opens the door and removes the keys from his belt, I'll give the order to hop, but nobody is to move until I issue it. When do you think the janitor will come? Tumtum asked. Oh, I don't know, the general snapped, but if he wants to feed us to the owls, then it's in his interest to fatten us up. I should think he'll come soon enough. Very good, General, Tumtum said, looking at his watch. We'd better hurry up and hide. It's nearly 8 o'clock, and the school will be opening soon. We're starving, one of the gerbils cried. Did you bring us anything to eat? Oh, I don't think you'll be short of things to eat, Tumtum said, shining his flashlight over the labels on the cardboard boxes. You've been locked up in the school's candy cupboard. And that's the end of chapter 12. There are 3 more chapters in this section, The Great Escape. And then there is one more book in this big book. It's called The Pirate's Treasure. If you think we should read The Pirate's Treasure, let me know. If you think we should start a new book with different characters, let me know. And we'll see what we do. But until next Wednesday, when we hear more about The Great Escape, will General Marshmouse and the gerbils be saved? Or will they be fed to owls? Oh no. Listen next week to find out the conclusion. Miss you lots. Take care. Enjoy your beautiful weather. Bye.